right. Welcome. We're going to get started. So this is sort of a special Wednesday night session of our live workshop because I couldn't do it on Saturday. So kind of doing this a little bit later in the week. Probably will not go the whole time. All right. And just check in all of our audio stuff to make sure that stuff is good. All right, looks like audio is good enough, so we're gonna roll on through. Okay, so let's hop over to this presentation. So this week in the class, we are talking about exploring and finding a topic for our literature review essay. All right, making sure I got all the stuff set. Okay, so I'm gonna hop into it. Get this back up here. There we go. All right, so just some announcements for my online students, which I think you probably got most of these from the announcements in our Blackboard class, but I am still uploading some topic resources, but the one for food and the one for music is up. So it's taking a little bit longer than I thought it would to go through and source articles and books and stuff. So it's taking me about a day to do each one. So the movies and the comic books will be up by the end of the week. So hopefully going into the weekend, those will be up. So I'll try to work on it some tomorrow and some on Friday, so that stuff will be available for the weekend. But you won't need any of the actual articles or books or anything for the stuff that we're doing this week. You will need that stuff for what we are doing next week. Grade updates. So because I've been spending most of my time trying to get the topic stuff up, I haven't had a ton of time to grade stuff. So it's probably going to be early next week by the time I get to the stuff from week 3, 4, and 5. So be expecting those updates next week. I did post something in Blackboard for you to track your own progress. So you can go look at that announcement, and it tells you how to calculate your standing in the class, since we don't do traditional grades. Where you should be at right now is at about 25%. But keep in mind that I also still have stuff to grade from the first 4 weeks of class. So that 25% covers the first 4 units that we did, so the first 4 weeks of class. So you should be around 20 to 25%. Now in your class, if I've only graded the first 2 units and you already have like 20 to 25%, that means that you're ahead of the game. If I have not graded your stuff yet and you're at like 10% or something like that, well, don't worry too much, because that score might go up after I get things graded. So really 25% is kind of what we're shooting for going into week 5, where you want to be at. So I went into a lot of detail explaining how to track your progress and stuff. So if you want to figure that out, go check out the weekly digest that I posted on Tuesday. And then just like getting help in the class. So I do these live virtual sessions so that you guys can get help. So I would recommend attending them if you can and asking questions, because this will probably be like one of the easiest ways for online students to get help, because I'm doing these every week. outside of these workshops, if you need help, you can send me an email. If it's a quick question, where it's really quick, really specific, email is probably faster. But if you're having like trouble like understanding an assignment, you probably want to schedule an appointment with me to either meet with me during my office hours on campus or via Teams, or meet with me outside of my office hours to get help. If you're not able to meet with me, then you can always sign up for tutoring using the Scotty, which is in our Blackboard. If you go to Student Resources and go to the Student Success Center area in the Student Resources, there's a bunch of information in there about how you can get help from the Scotty, how you can sign into it. You can access it through Blackboard and through eStorm, I think. So I would definitely recommend getting help if you need it. All right. So moving along, as always, if you have questions while I am going through something, please feel free to ask. Otherwise, I'm just gonna barrel on through this stuff. Otherwise, we'll be here until like 10 o'clock tonight. So, but if you have questions, I'm happy to stop and answer your questions. All right. So in this lesson, we're gonna learn how to read difficult academic texts. So a majority of the texts that you'll be using for your literature review and your analytical essay are going to be an academic text of some sort. So either a book or an article. And some of those are really difficult to read because they're written for other academics and researchers. So we're going to practice doing some of that reading today and how to break down those texts so that they're understandable. We're also going to engage in inquiry. So inquiry is asking questions, and we're going to engage in asking questions through writing, reading, discussion, and research. So after we do that, we're going to talk about some brainstorming techniques and how to actually write about stuff that you're interested in. And then we're going to go into one of the techniques we're using this week, which is brainstorm cubing, to come up with ideas for our literature review, and we're going to talk about our working thesis. All right, so one of the readings that you had for this week was reading in a writing class, and I'm going to go over that stuff first. So why do you need to build content knowledge to write an essay? Well, the simplest answer is so that you have something to write about, so you know what you're talking about. If you don't have the knowledge to talk about a topic, then it's going to be really difficult to actually write about that topic. So that's really important, is building your content knowledge. And that's what we're doing the first half of the semester with the literature review, is you all are building your content knowledge on a specific topic. And then the second half of the semester, when you do your analytical essay, you would now have that new knowledge that you can apply to a piece of media. Why is it important to do quick research while you read? So, especially when you're reading academic texts, you want to have like a dictionary or Google or something open or next to you so that you can look up stuff you don't understand. So quick research is just like looking up words you don't understand, looking up theories, because it'll help you understand the reading better. There's a lot of times when you can read something and sort of skip over a word that you don't understand, and you can try to kind of pick up the context of the meaning based on the words around it. But with these research essays, because they're packed with so many theories and so much research on stuff, you're gonna have to do some kind of research while you're reading to fully understand what it is you're reading, until you develop enough content knowledge that you don't have to do that. So that's why you want to do quick research while you read, so you can actually understand the stuff that you're reading. So what does it mean to read rhetorically? So in some of the earlier units, we talked about the rhetorical situation, which is writer, their audience, the topic, the genre, the context, their purpose for writing, all of those things. So when you read rhetorically, it means that you're reading with those things in mind. So you're thinking about who is the author as you're reading. When and where was this text published? And how does that affect the way that you think about that text. What is the argument? So what argument is the author trying to make? What are they trying to convince you of? What supporting evidence are they using to support that argument that they're trying to make? What is the author's purpose? So why did they decide to write this piece of academic text or write this essay or whatever? Who is the audience? And so this is going to be really important for you all, because you're not their primary audience. Like, you're not their target audience. They're writing to other people in their same field of study or field of research. And so the tone, the way that they write, all of those things are really targeted at the people who are in their field and they already have some content knowledge or background knowledge about the stuff that they're talking about. You also want to think about what appeals does that author make. So ethos, pathos, logos. We talked about that before. So how are they trying to appeal to your emotions? Are they trying to appeal to a sense of authority? Are they trying to appeal to your logic? And then how is the text organized? Where is the information placed throughout the text? How are they presenting that information? So that's what it means to read rhetorically, is that you're thinking about all of these things as you're reading. Some other things to consider as you're reading is the author biased in some way? So is there an opinion that they have about something that's pushing them to sort of have an agenda for whatever it is that they're writing? Especially in these times that we live in, there is a lot of biased research out there. And so you just need to be aware of what that bias is, not so that you can not use that research, but that so you can use it wisely. Because even if something is biased, it doesn't mean that the facts or the research that they're providing is bad research. It just means that they're kind of skewing it towards what they want it to. So you need to sort of be aware of that as you're looking at things. Then you want to think about, is this author credible for the topic that they're writing about? Are they an authority on this particular topic? So is this person writing about something that they actually know a bit about? Or is this a new topic for them? And then how do you know that? How can you tell from the way that it's written or what they've used? How can you tell that they actually know what they're talking about? Then, is the author being supported by a special interest group? So a special interest group could be something like MADD, Mothers Against Drunk Driving, MADD. So if Mothers Against Drunk Driving hired an author to write something for them, well, that author's probably going to be biased towards, their agenda, which is to prevent drunk driving. So those are kinds of things to think about when you're reading something. Special interest groups aren't necessarily a bad thing, but it's just one more thing to be aware of. Is the author writing from a personal experience, or are they sort of relating to like a third party or a secondhand account? So it's very different when somebody's writing from an experience that they went through themselves. So, for example, as a woman of mixed race, because I am white and black, I have a completely different experience from somebody who is completely black or completely white. So I probably couldn't write from talking from somebody who is purely white. I don't know what their experience is because I'm not white all the way, right? And the same thing for writing from somebody's experience of being black. But they also couldn't write from my experience of being somebody who's mixed race. So that's what it means to write from personal experience. Now, certainly I could write about all of those different groups, but my experience is going to be different just because of who I am. Just like I might write about male, issues that men might have, but I'm not a man. So I'm not going to fully understand, the level of complexity of those issues because I don't have to live through them. And it's sort of the same thing if a man was trying to write about my issues as a woman. He's not going to have a complete understanding of that because he's not a woman. So those are things to kind of keep in mind when you're thinking about writing from personal experience. And then also, is the publisher or the publication biased? So again, It's not necessarily a negative thing. Whenever we think about bias, we always sort of instantly think of something that's kind of negative, but this could even be something as simple as, am I writing for like a food magazine? So maybe this food magazine is going to be biased in some way, you know, as simple as, you know, we only write about food in our magazine. We don't write about cars or sports or anything like that. We just write about food. So those are all other considerations that you should have when you're looking at these academic texts. So a few ways that you can go through and break down an academic text is by looking at the title. Most academic texts are going to tell you exactly what that article or chapter or whatever is about in the title. That's sort of the difference between fiction and nonfiction, especially like academic nonfiction, is there's no real surprises in academic nonfiction. We're not trying to like convince you to buy this book or anything like that by giving it some obscure abstract title. No, we need you to know pretty upfront what it's going to be about, because we are writing to other scholars, and scholars don't have time to decipher your really fancy creative name. They just want to know, what is your book about? So that's how come you'll see a lot of academic texts, whether it's like a textbook or if it is an article or a chapter, the naming is usually pretty straightforward. And if it does have a creative title, it will usually have a straightforward subtitle. So usually it'll make it pretty easy to tell what it's about. The second way to kind of break a text down is by looking at the thesis statement. So the thesis will usually come at the very end of the introduction somewhere. Regardless of the length of the introduction, whether it's a paragraph or a few pages, the thesis will be somewhere kind of towards the end. The thesis is going to tell you exactly what that thing is going to be about. So if it is the introductory chapter of a book, somewhere in the first few pages of that introduction, it's going to tell you what this entire book is about, or what the entire introduction is about. So you want to try to identify the thesis statement. Your introduction is going to give you pretty much a context for why they're writing this. Introductions are really good for figuring out the author's purpose, because they will usually tell you the purpose for writing in the introduction, as well as kind of setting the stage for why they are writing this. They may or may not give you background information in the introduction, depending on what the background information is. Sometimes the first few body paragraphs or the first section of the body might also be background information. So in general, the introduction is going to give you kind of context to why I'm writing this essay, why I think it's important, and some very overarching kind of background information. The section headers are kind of the same as a title. You can use section headers to quickly navigate through an article or a book to kind of figure out what each section is about. Just like with the title, usually the sections are pretty straightforward. If the section title is creative, it will usually have a subtitle that is more straightforward. Topic sentences. So topic sentence is the first sentence of a paragraph, and these will usually let you know what the rest of the paragraph is about. So if you're reading the topic sentence, like it's the first paragraph of a section, and you read that first sentence, generally it'll kind of give you an idea of what that section is going to be about, a little bit like the thesis. And then the conclusion will usually sort of sum up everything. It might not be a complete summary of everything that was discussed, but it'll definitely summarize like the key points and the key arguments that were being made. And it'll usually tell you like avenues for other research. As you're going through and looking at the essays the essays, articles, and chapters from the books that you want to use for your literature review, you can quickly scan through those without having to read the whole thing. So each folder is going to have about 20 articles or books in it, and the books have multiple chapters. So you're thinking, or really you're looking at, there's going to be anywhere from like 30 to 70 articles or chapters that you could possibly use for this essay that you're going to do. And you are not going to have time to read all of that stuff. So the quickest way to go through and just start saying like, nope, I don't want to use this, is by looking at the title. If you see something and it has a title that sounds interesting and you think you might want to use it, your next step is to look at the thesis. So does their argument sound interesting? Does it sound like something you might want to consider for your paper? After you read the thesis, read the introduction. So does the introduction sound interesting? Do you think that you could get on board with what this person is talking about? Are you convinced by their argument? Then I would skip to the end and read the conclusion, because that'll give you sort of an overview of what the rest of the article is about. So those are some quick ways to kind of speed read a lot of academic articles in a short amount of time. It's essentially the same thing I'm doing to try to find articles for all of these projects and stuff. Is I look at the title and I try to figure out, okay, does this title make sense for what we're trying to do in this class? If we're looking at media and culture, if it doesn't, I just automatically get rid of it. It's no good. So if the title looks good, I'll usually go into it and look at the thesis and look at the introduction. And if those parts look good, I'll usually skip somewhere in the middle to another section. I'll start looking at section headers to see if it's going to have stuff in it that's useful. And if I'm like, it had promise, but it's not really getting there for me, then I just get rid of it. But if it looks like something that might be of interest, then I put it in the folder. So that's essentially what you're going to be doing when you're going through and looking at your articles. All right. So I'm going to kind of do lecture on both of the topics for this week, and then we're going to dive into our practice, where we're going to practice our two activities. So the next article that you had was exploring and finding a topic. So one of the things that I tell students when they're thinking about what topic they want to write about, so in my class, I give you 4 topics that you can pick from. So you can pick from food, movies, music, or comic books. And you can write not anything about those, but we do have a specific focus on like identity, representation, culture when you're looking at that stuff. But when you're thinking about topics for like other classes that are more open-ended, where you can just write about anything, one of the things that I always recommend to students is that you write about stuff that you're passionate about. When I was an undergrad, so when I first started school, whenever I had to write a paper, I always tried to write a paper about stuff that I cared about. So things that I was either passionate about or interested in. I tried to find a way to make that stuff work for my classes. So in almost every class, I either wrote about something horror related, so either a horror novel or a horror movie. I wrote about movies a lot. I wrote a ton of stuff about movies, or I wrote about art, or I wrote about anime. Those were like the 4 things that I always wrote about for all of my papers. And I could always figure out a way to make it work for whatever subject that we were in, with the exception of mechanical engineering. That was the only class I couldn't really make it work for because our topic was very, very specific. But for every other class, I usually wrote about one of those things. To just give you an example, I had a speech class, and I can't even remember what speech we had, like what was the topic of the speech that we had to do, but I basically wrote it about this movie called Jinro. It's the movie that I wrote it for was a Japanese anime, and it was like an alternate reality Japan, I think it was. It's been a really long time since I've seen it. But it was basically like this fascist government had taken over, and it was a very 1984 plot line, and I really thought it was cool. And that's what I wrote I did my speech on, because I didn't want to do it on anything else. So, and it just happened to work out for whatever the topic was of that speech. But even in other classes, I always figured out a way to write about the stuff that I wanted to write about. And with a little bit of creative thinking, you all can do that too. So we're going to look at a couple of examples. So if you're joining me here on Twitch, this is a platform for playing video games. So the perfect thing to sort of talk about first is, what if I'm interested in video games and I'm taking a world history class? Well, now, normally, a world history class, depending on where you're going to school and that kind of thing. When I was in school, our world history was in 2 classes. We had History of Civilizations 1 and History of Civilizations 2. And the first one was up until like the Middle Ages, and then the second one was the Middle Ages until modern times. So if I wanted to write about video games in that first history class, the one up until the Middle Ages, well, obviously they didn't have video games before like 1980. Not really. So how could I write about video games in a class that is about ancient history till the Middle Ages? Well, one of the things that I could do is video games are just another form of game. So I could just talk about games. Since the start of human civilization, and probably before, when we were still kind of wandering the tundras and living in caves, we had games. We've had games for as long as we've been around. So I could write about the games from ancient times. I could write about stuff like the Olympics. If we're talking about sort of doing stuff from like the Middle Ages or something like that, there are plenty of video games that are set in like the Middle Ages or set in those kinds of time periods. If we're talking about more modern history, then you could talk about games like Assassin's Creed, which take place in history. So yes, it has sort of a science fiction element to it where he's traveling through time and he's an assassin and there's this fantasy element to it, but there is like a historical element to it. I can't remember which Assassin's Creed game it is, but one of them has to do with like Italy and the Medici and stuff like that. And I was super into art history, and the Medici are like amazing. And when that game came out, I was like so excited because I was like, I know what that is. And I think they even had like some of the famous like works of art and stuff in the game. And that was like super fascinating. And so if I had an open-ended assignment in a history class, I might talk about the use of classical art in modern video games. And as long as I'm talking about stuff from my history class in the time period, it should still kind of work. But you want to make sure that it's going to work for the assignment. So always ask your instructor if it's okay. So be sure of that. But we have other games like Call of Duty. There's plenty of Call of Duty games, or I think Battlefield is another one, that are set during like World War II or different wars. And then, of course, an oldie but goodie from my olden days of being a little kid is Oregon Trail. I recently replayed Oregon Trail, and I think I did actually make it to the end, and everybody survived. Nobody died. But Oregon Trail is like a great game because you're basically sort of living that life. Oh no. My computer's having a conniption. Let's see here. Oh, there we go. So there's all these kinds of ways that I could write about video games in a history class with just a little bit of creative thinking. But always kind of run it by your teacher just to be sure that it's going to work, because it won't always work for every class. But all right, so here's another example. So let's say that I wanted to talk about hunting. So maybe I'm a hunter and I like to hunt, and I'm taking a philosophy class and we have to write a paper. So if I want to relate it to something that I'm interested in, because I actually had a student in a past class and I was like, well, what are you interested in? And he was like, I'm not interested in anything except hunting. And I was like, okay, we can try to work with that. So if that's the case, well, philosophy, like those classes are all about like morality and ethics and human nature and the development of human thought and those kinds of things. Just, thinking and critical thinking, but also sort of these bigger issues of like morality. So if we're looking at that and I want to talk about hunting, then I could talk about the morality of hunting animals. I could talk about, this whole idea of, does an animal have the same rights as you and me? So this idea of, if you're going with the whole meat is murder thing, I could talk about those kinds of things. I might talk about the ethics of hunting. So a great example of that is I'm from the South and we do like a lot of deer hunting in the South. But part of the reason for that is that we have to because we've killed all the wolves. So there's no natural predator for deer in the woods because we don't have like a ton of bears and stuff that are going to hunt them. You know, the wolf was the deer's natural predator. Well, we've eliminated that predator, so there's nothing to control deer populations during the winter, and most of them end up starving to death. So the way to sort of help with population control with deer is to hunt them. And so ethically, you know, we're actually protecting them by hunting them. And so that's something that I could talk about in a paper. You can also talk about like hunting and human nature or human instinct, because that's sort of our natural instinct. It's just like with any other kind of predatory animal, you know, like dogs, cats, anything that eats meat is used to hunting. And even as humans, as developed as we are, there is this aspect of us that does enjoy the hunt. It's why a lot of people are overachievers and that they do sports and things like that, because it helps fulfill sort of that kind of instinct within us to be out there and hunting and things like that. So those are all ways that you could kind of focus a paper that's a philosophy paper on something that you're interested in. So once again, you do want to run those kinds of topics by your teacher just to make sure that it is going to fit the requirements of the assignment. But it's just to give you a general idea that if it is an open-ended topic and you can write about anything, you can literally take anything you're interested in and make it work for a class with just a little bit of creative thinking. All right. Any questions so far? Otherwise, I'm going to keep on moving ahead. So the next thing is some brainstorming techniques. So I'm not going to go into like a lot of detail with these. If you're really interested in it, you can look them up. I think the reading for this week talks about some of these. I know it talks about the free writing and the mind mapping. So one way that you can kind of brainstorm ideas is by making lists. That's a great way of doing things. So especially if you're trying to come up with like a list of topics, like stuff you're interested in, just make a list and see if any of those things that you're interested in correspond with the topics that we're going to be doing for this class. You can do some free writing. So basically it's kind of the same like journaling. I used to journal like all the time when I was still a student, and I wrote about all kinds of stuff, not just like school stuff. So one of the great things about free writing is it helps get ideas out of your head. And it also, the just physical act of writing stuff out will actually help you work through complex ideas or thoughts or concepts. So you actually solidify that concept when you physically write it. So it's a good thing to kind of get into the habit of doing free writing because it'll help you solidify ideas. There's also a concept called mind mapping, and it works the same way, sort of like outlining or doing lists, but you're basically like drawing circles and connecting stuff with like lines and things like that. We're going to actually do a mind map the second half of the semester on week 10. I think we're going to be doing some mind mapping stuff. If you want, like, another thing is having like an idea book. So I have an idea book. I usually keep it on me and I just jot down ideas that come to me, and I have ideas for all kinds of stuff. So if I have ideas for like a website, or if there's something that I want to like do in class and I think I might want to try it, or like a new activity, or if I have an idea for like a story, like a short story or a novel, I write all of that stuff down in like different idea books. I have like 20 different idea books for just different topics. But I would recommend having one because it's a great place to get those ideas out of your head. One, so you don't forget them. And two, just so it's not taking up mental space. So you're not like kind of like focusing on that thing and it's sort of like a flashing red light in your mind of think of me, because you've written it down somewhere and it's like recorded. So that's why I like using idea books. And then the last one is to just have like outlines. So it's a little bit like the listing stuff. So you can just make outlines of things. All right. So this advice came straight from the stuff in the reading. So if you're trying to find a topic, some ways that you can figure out which topics you're going to be passionate about is to think about something that pisses you off. So usually when something makes us angry, we're invested enough in it and passionate enough about it that it makes us mad when it's whatever. So usually writing about those kinds of things, you can stay motivated to write about them because you're so passionate about it. The same goes for if you're really excited about something. So if something brings you joy and it makes you happy, it's usually a lot easier to write about because you're actually interested in what it is you're talking about. Then if there's something that you're really good at, it's usually a little bit easier to write about that stuff too, because you will probably already have significant knowledge about it. So if let's say that you were really into sports, like you like playing basketball, you probably have a ton of knowledge already about basketball, not just sort of the mechanics of playing that game, but you might know a lot about the people who play. So the different sports stars who play basketball, you might know some of the history of basketball. So kind of thinking about the stuff that you're really good at is helpful because you probably already have content knowledge about it. And then the other two kind of go along with that, basically. So, all right, time to jump into the practice activities. All right, so the first one that we're going to talk about is this annotation practice activity. So if you go to Unit 2, Exploring and Finding a Topic, it's the very first activity you're going to see, and it's going to be a little bit different than the annotations you guys done in the past. So the annotations that you've done previously were very basic, and it was doing stuff like just simply defining terms or asking questions or things like that. With this annotation practice, you're actually going to be practicing figuring out how to interpret a text. And you're going to be practicing your quick research skills. So we're going to go through and do a little bit of that, and then I'm going to show you an example. All right, so we're going to be looking at this article. It's called Monster Culture, 7 Thesis. It's by Jeffrey Jerome Cohen. And the things that we're going to be looking for are any important ideas, concepts, assumptions, arguments that the author's making. All right, so if you are following along from home, if you will go to the course website, so you can get to that through Blackboard. So if you are in Blackboard and you go to Unit 2 and go, the very first thing in Unit 2, you should see something that says Learning Materials. If you click on the link that's underneath that, it's going to take you to the website. Once you're on the website, it's going to take you straight into the Unit 2 page. If you scroll down on that page, it's the third link. It'll say Module 5, I believe, and it'll say Exploring and Finding a Topic. Once you're on that page, if you scroll down, you will see under the practice activities, you will see the annotation practice instruction sheet. And under the supplemental resources, you will see the actual article. So if you want to follow along, I would recommend pulling up the article. On the side of the article, you'll see a square button with a little arrow in it. That'll let you pop out the article into its own tab so you can look at it a little bit bigger than if it's just on the website. Whoops. I'll hop over to the website really quick. So this is the page, so this is the Exploring and Finding a Topic page. If you scroll down to the practice activities, here is the annotation practice instruction sheet, and it tells you what we're going to be doing. We're only going to be looking at the first 4 theses of this particular article, and it gives you some instructions on how to do this activity. All right, and then a little bit further down is the actual article itself. And so if you click on this button, this little pop-out button over here on the side, I'll move out of the way. So if you click this little button here, then it'll actually open it in a new window and then take forever to load because it's a pretty big file. Yep, so there is the actual file. So if you wanted to follow along, then you guys can do that. All right, let's see if we can actually use this or if I'm in the way too much. Okay. Yeah, I'm gonna have to go back to the other screen. All right, so I'm just going to be going through this. Like, I'm only going through the introductory part before Thesis 1, and I'm going to break it down for you how you would break it down if you were reading it. So if you have any questions while I'm going through and, whoops, breaking this text down, my mouse is like super sensitive. Feel free to ask questions as I'm going through and breaking this down. All right. Let me go back up. There we go. All right, so this is literally the first sentence of this essay. What I will propose here by way of a first foray as an entrance into this book of monstrous content is a sketch of a new modus legendi, a method of reading cultures from the monsters they engender. So this is the very first sentence. So as a student, you're probably reading this and asking yourself, what the hell is this guy talking about? Especially because it has probably a lot of words in it that you don't understand. So when I did this stuff in class, one of the words that students didn't understand was foray. So they didn't know what foray meant. Modus legendi was a new word, and also this word engender. So what we're going to do is we're going to do that quick research method. So I have already done the quick research for these words, but basically what you would do is if you didn't understand what foray was, you would go and look it up. So you would open up Google or open up a dictionary and type in foray. You would do the same thing with modus legendi, but this one's a little bit special because usually when you look up modus legendi, it's going to take you back to this article. But I'm going to give you a trick for figuring out what this word means. And then the last word that they had to look up was engendered. So we're going to look at what these words mean, and then we're going to re-look at this passage. So a foray is a sudden attack or incursion into enemy territory. So basically what he's saying in the first part of this sentence is, what I will propose here by way of first attack is basically how I'm going to attack this topic. And when he's talking about as entrance into this book of monstrous content, so this essay is the introduction to a book called Monster Theory. So when he's literally talking about it's literally a book of monstrous content. It's literally a book of essays about monsters. So that's what the second part of this means. All right, as a sketch of a new modus legendi. So he's basically saying in these first two sections up here, is in this introduction, I'm going to talk about, and then we're going to talk about modus legendi. So a good way of figuring out what modus legendi means is to think about something that sounds similar. So there's a similar word called modus operandi, if you've ever heard that. Usually it's used in like medical shows or not medical shows, but like CSI type shows or criminal show, like SVU. I'm trying to think of like all of these, there's a term for it, these police procedural shows. So they always talk about the perpetrator or the person who's committing the crime had a modus operandi. And that literally means a mode of operations. So it's a systematic way of doing something. So if modus operandi means a mode of operations, then it stands to reason that modus means mode and legendi means legend. So it literally is a mode of legends. So if we go back and look at this passage again, he's saying is a sketch of a new modus legendi. He's basically saying, I'm going to give you a new way of looking at the method or a new method of looking at legends. That's essentially what he's saying with that passage there. And then engendered means to cause or give rise to. So a method of reading cultures from the monsters they give rise to, or the monsters that emerge from a culture. So now that we've looked up these terms, if I was going to restate this kind of in my own words, he's basically saying the way that I'm going to attack the topics in this book is by looking at a new way of looking at legends. I'm going to give you a new method for looking at legends, and that method for looking at legends is by reading cultures based on the monsters that those cultures create. That's essentially what he's saying in this passage. Alright, we're going to move on to the next passage. In doing so, I will partially violate two of the sacred dicta of recent cultural studies, the compulsion to historical specificity and the insistence that all knowledge, and hence all cartographies of that knowledge, is local. Alright, so we've got a few more crazy words in here. So the first one is sacred dicta. So what does that mean? The next thing is, what does he mean by historical specificity? So what is that? And if you don't know like the word compulsion, you might also ask like, what does it mean to this compulsion to historical specificity? And then what is cartographies of knowledge? So what does that mean? So we're going to look at the first one. So a sacred dicta is basically kind of something that we assume to be true, like it is a truth or a principle, basically. And so a sacred dicta is like a sacred truth or a sacred principle by which these people kind of conduct their research. So the very first part up in here, up until the colon, is saying, I'm going to violate these two sacred principles of recent cultural studies. So basically, in the field of cultural studies, these are two principles that a lot of cultural studies people live by, and he's going to violate those with the articles and essays in this book. Alright, so talking about historical specificity basically means it's specific to a historical time and place. So it's going to take place in a specific time and a specific geographical space in history. So when he's talking about a compulsion to historical specificity, he means that they are compelled to look at events and only look at those events and how they took place in a specific place at a specific time. So that's one thing that those people do. The second thing is this idea of cartographies of knowledge. So a cartography or a cartographer is somebody who makes maps. So cartography is the study of maps. So a way that you could sort of look at this is cartography means maps. So this is literally a map of knowledge. So when he talks about this insistence that all knowledge is local, and hence all cartographies of knowledge are local, he's basically saying that the way that we map knowledge and knowledge in general is local. And so what he means by that is it takes that knowledge is specific to that time and that place, just like the history is specific to that time and that place. So if I'm kind of breaking this sentence down and restating it so it makes more sense, then he's basically saying that I'm going to go against these two things that cultural studies people believe. One is that history takes place in a specific time and place, and that knowledge also takes place in a specific time and place, that it is local to that place. All right. Any questions so far? All right, moving on. Of the first, I will say only that in cultural studies today, history, disguised perhaps as culture, tends to be fetishized as telos, as a final determinant of meaning, post-Deman, post-Foucault, post-Hayden White. One must bear in mind that history is just another text in a procession of texts, and not a guarantor of any singular significance. Alright, so again, he's thrown kind of a lot of stuff at us with this one. So we're going to break it down again. So, of the first, I will say only that in cultural studies today, history tends to be fetishized as telos. So, this he's talking about historical specificity. So, history taking place, like history being specific to a time and place. So, what does it mean to fetishize something, and what is telos? So, when we fetishize something, we're basically, it's an excessive or irrational devotion or commitment to a particular thing. It's being obsessed with it. It's like an obsession. And then telos is an ultimate object or aim. It's an end goal. So if we're talking about history and this compulsion for specific or historical specificity, what he's saying is they are obsessed with the end goal of that historically specific thing. So if you think about like the Industrial Revolution is historically specific, and they only care about that kind of one specific thing about like the Industrial Revolution. The same thing for any other thing that is sort of summed up with like one statement is they kind of fetishize this whole, I can sum this up with just a simple statement. So that's kind of the first part that he's talking about here. And now this post-Deman, post-Foucault, post-Hayden White. So if we look at that part, these are all people. So these are the last names of really famous historians and literary critics. So he's saying after Deman, after Foucault, after Hayden White, we have to keep in mind that history is just one more text in a procession of text. And we can't sort of make it a singular, we can't go to history and find something that is the one singular thing that is important about it. So if you look at the period of the Industrial Revolution, there was a ton of stuff that happened during the Industrial Revolution. We got steam trains, we got factories. It was the first time that we had sort of the factory system. Changes in labor happened. So it wasn't just one singular significant thing that happened. It was a progression of historical events that happened to make up the Industrial Revolution. And that's something that he's saying that you need to keep that in mind, that this isn't just one thing. It is a procession of things that happened. It's a procession that will continue. Things happen before it, and things are going to have to happen after it. All right. So we're going to move on to the next piece. All right, so here's our next section. A movement away from the longue durée and toward microeconomics of capital or of gender is associated most often with Foucauldian criticism. Yet recent critics have found that where Foucault went wrong was mainly in his details and his minute specifics. So we've got a French term here, longue durée, and we've got a maybe also equally unfamiliar term of microeconomics. So what do those two things mean? And then when we might want to look up this idea of Foucauldian criticism. So basically we can tell from the way that this word is structured, Foucauldian is related to Foucault. So it is the criticism of Foucault. It is his theory of criticism. So we're going to look at those pieces in the first part of this sentence. So if we go online and we look up longue durée, it literally translates to long duration. That is what those words translate to in French. but it is a French theory of history that values long-term historical structures over singular events. Whereas microeconomics, when we are talking about history, it is focused on single factors and individual decisions. So if we're talking about a movement away from this idea of looking at history as a long series of events towards looking at history as a series of micro events, that movement away from the long to the short is often associated with Foucauldian criticism. That's what the first part is saying. All right, so the second part is he's basically saying that recent critics, so critics from our era, have found fault with Foucault in that maybe his specifics were too detailed. He was looking at things in a too specific a way. And to just give you a little bit of background about Foucault, Foucault was mostly focused on power relationships in society as expressed through like language and literary criticism and those kinds of things. All right. And again, all of this stuff here, I literally did a Google search for. Like, I did a quick little Google search as I was kind of reading through this, and I put it on these slides. And that's essentially what you're doing as you're going through and breaking down this text. As you're going through and you're going to do just quick research to kind of figure out what this stuff is talking about. All right. And so I would like to make some grand gestures. We live in an age that has rightly given up on unified theory, an age when we realize that history, like individuality, subjectivity, gender, and culture, is composed of a multitude of fragments rather than a smooth epistemological wholes. All right, so again, we've got some unfamiliar stuff in here. Mostly it's this unified theory and then the epistemological wholes. So what do those two things mean? So from what I could gather from my research about unified theory is it is a physics theory. And basically they were trying to find a hypothetical theory that was all-encompassing and that could be a framework that would fully explain and link together everything in the universe. They were trying to basically find an explanation for everything in one single theorem. And we pretty much discovered that that's impossible. Like, there's no way to create a theory that is going to explain everything. So that's what he's talking about here, that we live in an age where we've sort of given up on that idea, like it's not going to happen. Like, we're not going to find one theory that's going to explain everything. And he's saying that just like we've realized that there isn't one theory that's going to explain everything, we also have to realize that history is not just one epistemological whole. So epistemology is the study of knowledge, especially the distinction between a justified belief, so a belief that's backed up with support and evidence, versus just an opinion. If you have an opinion about something, but you can't back it up with anything to support it, it's just an opinion. So that's what we talk about when we're doing these research articles, and the stuff that you're doing is that you're going to be supporting your opinions. So it's not just an opinion anymore. That's what makes it an argument, is because you can support it. So, but going back, epistemology is basically the study of knowledge. So basically what he's saying in this section is that history is composed of a multitude of fragments. Just like we can't find a unified theory of everything, we're not going to find a history that there's one way to look at history. It's a collection of different smaller micro histories. It's not knowledge as a whole. All right, and then we're getting close to the end. This is the second to last passage in this part. Some fragments will be collected here and bound temporarily together to form a loosely integrated net, or better, an unassimilated hybrid, a monstrous body. So remember that this is a book about monsters. So he is tying this introduction back to the contents of the book and to his overall argument that he made earlier about this being a monster culture. So, in referencing these fragments, two things I kind of identified in this section is this idea of a loosely integrated net and then this unassimilated hybrid. So, he's very specific on his word choice when talking about a loosely integrated net. So when you think about a net, it is a mesh with a lot of holes in it. So it leaves a lot of room for flexibility. Nets are really flexible. They're not very rigid. And so when he's talking about he's basically saying, I collected a bunch of essays that are loosely integrated together. And that fits into this idea of the unassimilated hybrid. So if we look up unassimilated and hybrid, an unassimilated thing is not absorbed and it's not integrated. And then a hybrid is made by combining different elements. So basically what he's saying is that the essays that are going to be in this collection are from all different, they look at all different kinds of things. They look at all different kinds of stuff in history, all kinds of different stuff in culture about monsters. And they're loosely connected, but they're not integrated. They're not kind of a melting pot. They're not meshed together to become one thing. So that's kind of what he's talking about, is that this is sort of a Frankenstein's monster of essays. And that's also goes back to this idea of this monstrous body. And I think that's why he's kind of mentioned monstrous body here. All right. And then this is our last part of the introduction. Rather than argue a theory of teratology, I offer by way of introduction to the essays that follow a set of breakable postulates in search of specific cultural moments. I offer 7 theses towards understanding cultures through the monsters they bear. Alright, so we've got teratology. We've got to look that one up. Postulates, we got to look that up. Maybe like a cultural moment. But I think we got pretty much the rest of it. So, teratology is literally the study of monsters. It is also the study of like abnormalities, and like kind of like birth defects and stuff like that. And then postulates are accepted or are suggested or assumed truths. So it's stuff that we assume to be true. So what he's saying is, I'm not going to argue a theory of monsters. That's not the point here. What I'm giving you instead is, in this introduction of essays, is going to be a set of things that you assume to be true, but they're breakable. That these are not absolute truths. That's what it means to have a breakable postulate. Is that these are not absolute truths, but these are malleable. You know, it's sort of like the whole net thing. These are flexible truths that we're going to use to search for specific cultural moments. Like, we're going to be looking for moments in culture as we're going through and doing these essays. And to that end, he's given us 7 theses towards understanding culture through the monsters that they create. And that's his ultimate argument. At the end of this whole thing, the argument that he's giving us is, at the end of this, ultimately what I'm arguing is that we can understand a culture from their monsters. Alright, so if we go and look at, we'll hop back over here. And we're going to hop into perusal really fast. Alright, so I just went through this first section of the thing that you're going to be annotating. So basically I went through this whole section here. And what I did for this section is essentially what you're going to do for this assignment. Is you're going to take out portions of this essay and you're going to explain it using the quick research method so that your fellow students can understand those portions better. So you're going to do 10 annotations, and I'm going to show you some possible ways that you can do those annotations to help make this a little bit easier for your fellow, like you and your peers, to understand. So again, you do have to spread your annotations kind of through the whole thing. I don't mind if you cherry pick your way through it to just explain stuff in pieces, but I would say you're probably going to have to kind of read around the sections that you're in to sort of understand everything. So rather than just defining a single term, like rather than going in here and saying, okay, this is what historic specificity is, like I did, all right. So you're not just going to put specific to historical time and space. Like, you're not doing that. You're actually going to go through and explain this in detail. So if you look at the section that I've got up here, I don't think I can make this any bigger. I can make it a little bigger. All right. The article is really tiny though, but so in this section, I basically said, in the field of cultural studies, Cohen is saying there are accepted truths. The first accepted truth is that circumstances such as history, geography, culture, institutional setup, etc., have to be accounted for when studying a culture. And second, all knowledge is local to a specific place and time. But he's arguing that maybe this isn't the only way to see culture or study it. Human nature and general human experience also play a part. So this is basically me explaining this in more detail. And that's what you need to do for the annotations that you're doing for this assignment, is you're going to be explaining these in more detail so that it makes more sense contextually. All right, so I also did the first section of the thesis. Let me hop over. Let's see if this one, yeah. All right, so I did historical specificity. I also did this very first paragraph here. So in this example, I did this paragraph of vampires, burial, death. Inter the corpse where the road forks, so that when it springs from the grave, it will not know which path to follow. Drive a stake through its heart. It will be stuck to the ground at the fork. It will haunt that place that leads to many other places, that point of indecision. Behead the corpse, so that acephalic, it will not know itself as subject, only as pure body. So what I did on this second one is I literally went through and broke down this paragraph almost word by word. So I started with the first sentence. So vampires, burial, death. When you have a colon like this in a sentence, it's used to clarify a statement. So admittedly, Cohen uses colons in a strange way in his writing, since colons are mostly used to clarify a statement by providing examples in the form of a list. So, for example, there are 3 types of muscles in the body: cardiac, smooth, and skeletal. He sort of does a reverse of that. So I'm kind of explaining his sentence structure here. With this part of the sentence, vampires, burial, and death are all really the same thing. So we're talking about elements associated with death and dying. So when I'm taking out this vampires, burial, death, this is my explanation for that part. The next part, inter the corpse where the road forks, so that where it springs from the grave, it will not know which part to follow. The word inter means to place a corpse, dead body, into a grave, usually with some kind of burial rites or ceremony. So basically this means to bury. And then I rewrote kind of the sentence. Vampires, burial, death, bury the corpse. Whenever someone mentions a crossroads or a road that forks, they are talking about a road that splits in at least 2 directions. This is also sometimes known as a crossroad. A crossroad is basically an intersection where 2 or more roads meet. Now, you're going to need a bit of monster lore for this section to make sense. Crossroads are commonly known as places where ghosts and demons hang out. There are countless stories of people making deals with the devil at crossroads. And if you've ever heard the saying, he's at a crossroad in his life, it means you're at a place where you can go in any direction or make any decision, with one road leading you to a good place and one road leading you to a bad place. Think about one of the Little Red Riding Hood stories, where Little Red Riding Hood could have taken the path of needles or the path of pins. So that's actually a Little Red Riding Hood story. She could go either way. She was at a crossroads, and her decision had good and bad consequences. There are other legends that say that vampires are born along crossroads. that if a body isn't buried properly, or if it's buried, or if a body is buried at a place where the roads cross, it will become a vampire. So what this part of the text is saying is vampires' burial death bury the corpse at a crossroad, so when it rises from the grave, it will be confused and not know which road to take. The next part, drive a stake through its heart, is basic vampire lore. You kill a vampire by stabbing it in the heart with a wooden stake, sharpened piece of wood. It would be stuck to the ground at the fork. It will haunt that place that leads to many other places. This part of the text is basically saying that if you kill a vampire at a crossroads, it'll be trapped there. This passage is trying to paint a picture in your head. Most people are familiar with the legends of vampires, ghoulish undead that rise from graves and coffins and drink the blood of the living. Here, Cohen is connecting them with crossroads. But why? Well, because vampires are stuck in a place between life and death. That's why they are called undead. The prefix "un" means the absence of a quality or state. In this case, it means the absence of death. They can't die, and they are not alive either. They are trapped between two worlds, trapped between two states of being, neither alive nor dead. So they are at a metaphorical crossroads. That's why he mentions the point of indecision at the end of this sentence. So this is kind of an interpretation. So that's okay. If you guys want to go through and you're trying to interpret his text, this is one way you can interpret it. The final part, behead the corpse so that acephalic it will not know itself as subject, only as a pure body. When he talks about beheading the corpse, that's another piece of vampire lore. In some legends, the only way to truly kill a vampire is by cutting off its head. The stake to the heart only wounds it. It only slows it down. You actually have to cut its head off to kill it completely. During the Middle Ages, when people in Europe really believed in vampires, if they buried a person but thought they were a vampire, usually because of stuff happening to their village, they would dig up the body and cut its head off to make sure that they didn't come back as something else. There are a lot of legends where decapitation is the only way to kill a monster. So to rewrite this part of the sentence, I would say, cut off the dead body's head. Cohen goes on to say, so that acephalic it will not know itself as subject. So acephalic means headless, so it doesn't have a head. Basically, this part of the sentence is saying that if a corpse doesn't have a head, it won't know what it is. It won't know it's a corpse, or a vampire, or a human, or anything else. Like the crossroads, it won't be able to decide what it is. Here, the word subject means a person. It won't know that it was a person or have a sense of what it was before. It will only know itself as a body. So my rewritten sentence would be, cut off the dead body's head so that the headless corpse won't ever know it was a person. It will only think of itself as what it is at that moment, a body and nothing else. So again, Cohen uses a metaphor here, and the rest of the section goes on to explain exactly what he means. So this really long passage was me explaining this paragraph of text. Now, obviously, I don't expect you guys to, write anything that long for your annotations. But it is just to give you sort of an idea of the kinds of annotations that you're making. So you're going to be going through and breaking these down into understandable parts and explaining them. That's essentially what you're going to be doing with the annotations that you're doing this week. All right. Any questions from the audience about this particular assignment? If not, kind of moving on. Oh, I may have forgotten to switch back over to browser. Oh well. Hopefully you guys were seeing that okay. It wasn't too horrible. Alright, brainstorm cubing. So for this activity, you're going to be brainstorming the ideas for your literature review topic and your working thesis. And we're going to practice doing a little bit of this brainstorm cubing. So once again, you're going to go to the website, go to the finding a topic. You're going to find a template for the brainstorm cubing. Let me switch over to the browser this time. So it's not looking so crazy. All right, so exploring, we're just going to scroll down a little bit. So this is a brainstorm cubing activity. And then this is the template. I mistakenly told one of my classes that you're going to be uploading a document. I forgot this is going to be a discussion post. So basically this is how your discussion post is going to look, is like this template. All right, so for this, the way this is going to work is you're going to pick a topic from the 4 that's listed on the website. You don't have to read any articles in order to do this particular activity. You can just do it with whatever knowledge you already have. So for each part of the cube, you're going to list 3 things, and the activity sheet is going to describe each section that you need to do it for, and then I'm going to go through and I'm going to show you how to do the 3 things. Then at the end, you're going to do an argument and you're going to do a working thesis, but I'm going to go through all of that. Then you're going to respond to 2 classmates and you're going to give them feedback on their working thesis. So that's what we're doing for the second one. All right, so let's close out of some of this stuff. So this is the template for the literature review brainstorm cubing. So the very first thing you've got is describe. We're going to go through all of these in this next activity, but I've given you some instructions here. Basically what you're going to do in Blackboard is you're going to scroll down to literature review brainstorm cubing. You're going to go to the discussion board. There is an example thread in there so you can see how yours should be set up. So it's basically going to look like this. So that's what you're going to be doing. For the example that I used, I did movies and cultural identity. So pretty much I'll be expecting to see something that looks very similar to this when you do your own post. So you can use mine as an example for how yours should be set up. Now, you don't have to have it formatted exactly like mine as far as like the different sizes of text and all of that stuff. But you do need to clearly label each section, describe, compare, connect, all of that. And then you do need to tell me what topic you're doing. So you don't have to do it on each one like I've done here. You can just put it at the top. Just tell me at the top what your topic is. So you can create a thread. It's going to have your name. And then you're literally going to put your topic. So if you go to the course website, go to writing projects, it lists all of the topics. So for my example, I did the movies and cultural identity. So we'll just use that. Movies, I'll make this a little bit bigger, so you can actually see what I'm doing. All right, movies and cultural identity is my topic. Then I'm going to do describe. Let me go look at this template. Describe, compare, connect. Analyze and understand. Argue, and working thesis. And then under each one of these, you're gonna have 3 bullet points. Where's my bullet points? So 1, 2, 3. You can also use the numbers if you want. So, let me can do numbers too. So however you want to do it, I don't care. Bullets and numbers. Just be consistent. So this is literally how you're going to set up your discussion post. And then you're going to write your working thesis. So that's what the formatting should look like. So if I go in and submit this, so see that you can just do it as simple as that. So that's what your formatting for your post is going to look like. But you can use a template on the course website to help you with coming up with each of your sections. But I'm going to walk us through how to do them. So we're going to go through and look at those. All right. Alright, so on the course website, if you go to Exploring and Finding a Topic, it's under Unit 2. Scroll down to the second activity. You'll find the Brainstorm Cubing Supplemental Resource. That's the template. And you can open the template if you're following along. So the first part of the template is describe. This is usually the easiest one to do. So I'm going to be using the example of food as cultural transmitter. So a cultural transmitter is anything that we use to transmit culture. So think about that the way babies learn how to speak. They learn by watching their parents, watching the people around them. That's essentially how babies learn everything about the world. And that's a cultural transmitter. They're literally taught culture through the stuff that they see around them, through their interactions with the people around them. We're also taught culture by the foods that we eat. So my mom was actually from Canada, and so there is a lot of cultural food that she brought with her from Canada that we ate in my household growing up that wasn't normal for the place that I lived. We had poutine. I actually didn't end up eating any poutine until I was a little bit older. But one of the things that we made every Christmas was tortilla, which is basically kind of like a meat pie, and it's delicious. I always look forward to Christmas because of that. But that was something that was very culturally specific to where she was from in Canada. And we have our own family recipe for how to make it. So another thing that I've eaten from Canada is something called a gidzi, and it's amazing. It's literally like a hot dog with french fries and coleslaw, and I know that sounds weird, but it tastes awesome. But that's kind of a cultural thing that my mom kind of brought with her from Canada, and we grew up with it. And my dad, who's from the South, he's basically lived in the South his whole life. He had, there's a lot of Southern stuff that him and his family like to eat. I was never into it, but my dad was a huge fan of chitlins. We never ate chitlins growing up. But that was something that was definitely part of our culture. If we went to family reunions or went to his family's house, plenty of family friends would make stuff like chitlins. But I never ate any of that. So, but I'm aware of it. So if I was going to describe food as a cultural transmitter to somebody, then I would probably talk about, the food that I grew up with. So those specific foods that I grew up with had an impact on the culture and the community that I was a part of. If I was somebody who grew up in Latin America, I'll do a perfect example since we're here on Twitch. So there is a person that's on Twitch. They're a VTuber that I follow, and she's amazingly awesome, and she's super funny. Her name is Iron Mouse, and she's Puerto Rican. And she talks a lot about the food, Puerto Rican food. And the whole tradition around Puerto Rican food is so very specific to their culture that if you're not Puerto Rican, you probably wouldn't get it. So, like, that's another way that I might describe food as a cultural transmitter to somebody, is that there are some foods that are so culturally specific that if you're not part of that culture, like, you just don't understand how important that is. So when I tell people about tortilla, they're never probably going to understand, like, as a kid, how excited I got about that meal. Like, it would take us all day to make it because it's a really complex recipe. And when you see it, you just are like, oh, it's like a meat pie. It's just like a pie filled with ground beef. No, it's got a lot of other ingredients and stuff in it. And it literally, like, we would make it in huge batches because it takes, like, it's so much effort to make, like, one pie that we would make, like, 10 pies and freeze them and eat them, like, over the course of, like, a few months and stuff. And it was, like, an all-day thing. And that was such, like, a really culturally specific moment for me that that's one way that I would describe how food is a cultural transmitter. And that's something that I got from my mom. Just like a few other things that I got from her that were kind of, you know, specific to that. But then I might also talk about, if I'm doing just a description, like soul food in the South is very specific to that region. Another story I kind of shared with students today, because my mom is from Canada, they make cornbread completely different there than they do in the South. So the cornbread that they make in Canada is really sweet. And the cornbread in the South, like, basically has no sugar in it. And I've made cornbread for people before, and they do not like it because they think it tastes like cake because it's so sweet. But, so that's another way that you can talk about food as a transmitter of culture. So your first step is going to be describing the thing. So how would you describe this to somebody who didn't understand what it means for food to be a transmitter? And a few ways that you can do that is you can talk about, like, specific spices. So, like, an Indian person or somebody who's from Indian or has an Indian background, their taste buds for certain spices is going to be so specific to their culture. Just like somebody who's in the South, like, if you are from, like, Louisiana and you eat a lot of Cajun food and you like really spicy stuff, like, your taste buds and your taste is going to be so specific to that particular culture and, like, how you like your food prepared. It's the same thing as, like, Chicago style pizza. You can't get that pizza anywhere else. Like, it's never the same. Even if it says it's Chicago style pizza, like, you know when you have Chicago style pizza. So that's how you would describe, if you were doing, like, food as a cultural transmitter. Like, so you're going to describe the characteristics of it. And you can try to do, like, a definition and stuff. So the next thing is you're going to compare. So you're going to take this topic, so food is a cultural transmitter, and you're going to compare it to another topic. So try to think of another thing that transmits culture. So one of the examples that we used in class was, like, food. So that we used in class was music. We used music and we used fashion. Those are the two that we did in class. So if you think about the ways that music is used to transmit culture, you know, not only does music have lyrics that help to, you know, kind of verbalize different aspects of culture, but, like, if you hear the tune, so, like, think about, like, your senses. So when you hear a specific sound, like, if you hear Indian music, it is such a specific sound, like, you instantly know you're listening to, like, Bollywood music. The moment it starts playing, you're like, that's Bollywood. And it's sort of the same thing with, like, K-pop. If you're listening to K-pop music, you know when you're listening to K-pop music. Just like you know when you're listening to death metal, and you know when you're listening to rap. Like, those songs and the way that they're arranged is so specific that you know it instantly the moment that the first few tunes are, like, strung or, like, played or whatever. But it's also the same with food. So the way you can compare that is there are certain foods, like, when you smell that food, you instantly know what it is. Like, it has a visceral smell to it. Like, you can literally, like, if I tell you, like, the smell of an orange, you can probably imagine that smell just instantly. And it's sort of the same way with music. So you can think about comparing, like, the senses and the way that we engage with those things. somebody else talked about fashion and how we use fashion to express ourselves. Well, you could say the same thing about food. Food, a lot of chefs and stuff use food as a form of artistic expression. If you've ever seen somebody decorate a plate of food, if you're one of those people who is like looks at food bloggers and you look at like the way that they stage their pictures and stuff, it's not that much different from how the people stage fashion shows and take pictures of like clothing and things like that. So that's what you're doing with the compare, is you're taking two things that seem like they would be really different, and then you're comparing them to each other. So you're looking at the similarities and the differences. So like with the whole music, it's a different sense. So one is hearing, one is taste and smell. But they sort of elicit sort of the same response, and they do the same thing functionally in cultures. All right, so connections. With this one, you're going to think about how does this topic connect to other topics or issues? And how does it connect with stuff that you've done before? So if we're looking at food and we're looking at music, one way that you can kind of think about food and music is festivals. Usually if we go to like any kind of like folk festival or rock festival, they always have food there. It's usually junk food. It's usually like fried food or street food. You'll usually have alcohol at those kinds of events. So that's one connection that can be made between like food and music. If you're talking about like food and fashion, one of my students in my class earlier today was talking about how in some Asian cultures, like, for example, like a Japanese tea ceremony, you have a specific outfit that you wear for that ceremony. And it's true for other things too. Like, think about, like, at a wedding, the whole idea of, like, the cake ceremony, like, when the bride and groom or whatever are cutting the cake and then they feed each other. Like, that's a whole kind of tradition or ceremony built around this idea of like food and a tradition or a ceremony. So that's what you're doing when you're making connections, is how can I connect this one thing with something else that seems unrelated? So how could you connect food with weddings? Or how could you connect, let's see. So we've done music. Oh, here's a good one. Like if you think about food and movies. So there's like a ton of food in movies. Like we often see characters like eating or drinking something, and the way that they do product placement in movies, so they show you like they're drinking a Coke or something like that, and they actually have to pay for those product placements, by the way, in movies. So you could talk about anything. So you're looking for ways to connect whatever your topic is to another topic or another issue. All right, so analyze is how can you break your topic down into smaller pieces? And what are different ways that you can break it down? So if we're talking about food, the easiest way to break down food is ingredients. So how does changing the ingredients of a dish make it a completely different dish? One way to sort of think about this is like rice. There are countries all over the world eat rice, but I guarantee you that the rice that you eat in Japan is going to be completely different from the rice that you eat in Mexico. Completely different flavors, completely different preparation. Also compared to the rice that you eat in Louisiana. So all of those are going to have different things because the ingredients are different, but some of the ingredients are the same. You could talk about food preparation. So the way that food is prepared is different in all kinds of dishes. So one way that I make soup might be completely different than the way that you make soup. To go back to the cornbread example, the way that I make cornbread is completely different from the way that everybody else in the South makes cornbread, because they don't put a cup of sugar in their cornbread. So that's what you're doing when you're analyzing it, is you're breaking it down into these kind of smaller parts to see how all of these different parts sort of connect together. All right, so think we're on the 5th side of the cube, is to understand. Make sure this is the 5th. Yep. So the 5th side of the cube is, how can you relate this topic to like a bigger social issue or concern? And how can you help, or how can it help you understand other topics, ideas, events? And how can this topic be used to teach somebody something? So if we're talking about food as a cultural transmitter, there's a ton of ways that you can use this idea of food and food as a topic and food as culture to talk about bigger social issues. And some of these are kind of addressed in the articles that we're going to be looking at if this is the topic that you choose. So one of the things that I kind of came across in the articles is the idea of food and gender. So traditionally, the preparation of food has been a very gendered thing in societies. Even back in America in the 1950s, like, it was usually women who prepared the food in a household. And there's a lot of countries around the world where it's the woman who cooks the meals. She prepares the food. So that's one kind of social issue that you could talk about, or it's one related thing, is this whole idea of gender being associated with food preparation. Another bigger social issue is the idea of food and food scarcity. So there are a lot of places where people have food insecurities, and you might think about places where food isn't readily available versus places where people literally waste food, or places where not only are they wasting food, but it's like a fad to go dumpster diving. You know, so that's like kind of a thing where I heard about that a few years ago, where like some really rich kids were going dumpster diving just for the fun of it. Whereas like that's like a reality for some people. Like, they don't have a choice, you know, like they have to do that or they'll starve. So those are kind of some bigger cultural or social issues that are kind of related to food. Food and nutrition is another one. There's this whole idea of going back to like natural foods. So trying to do like paleo and things like that, or the raw diet where you're not adding a bunch of additives and preservatives to food. And then how can you use food to teach people? So by having people eat foods from different cultures, it might teach you cultural acceptance. It might teach you how to be more considerate of other cultures because you're consuming the food from those places. So that's what you're going to be doing with the understand part of this activity. And then the 6th side of the cube is argue. So you're going to come up with a viewpoint, and then you're going to come up with an opposing viewpoint. So one possible viewpoint that you could have, food as a cultural transmitter. So maybe one of the points of view I have is that food brings people together. So that's going to be my viewpoint. A counter argument or a counter viewpoint to that is food tears people apart. One of the background articles you'll read, one of my students pointed this out, is apparently a couple of, I can't remember which country they said it was, but there was 2 countries in Europe that went to war over putting nutmeg on their eggnog. They literally went to war over that. So that's a counter argument that you're going to do. So that's what you're going to basically be doing for this last part, is you're going to present a viewpoint and then present a counter viewpoint. And it shouldn't just be something like, there's food scarcity. There's not food scarcity. So you need to actually, like, if you say, like, in some countries, there's food scarcity, people aren't able to eat, like, people are starving. And then you have some countries, but then saying, like, and some countries are wealthy and have a lot of food, that's not really a counter argument, that's all the same argument. So an actual counter argument to this idea of food scarcity would be that perhaps, well, I'm trying to think of like a good counter argument for the argument of food scarcity. Let's talk about, well, we can talk about, like in America, is I think that there's no argument that there's food scarcity. So you could say that, you know, in these underserved populations, there's food scarcity. And a counter argument can be, well, they have programs that provide those people with food. So, like, we have things like WIC and food stamps and stuff like that to help provide those people with food if they need it. So that's kind of the counter argument that you can make to that. So you want to think kind of critically about what you want to do for your arguments and not just sort of do just like an off-the-cuff like argument. The reason we're doing this brainstorm cubing activity, let me go back to the browser. Since we are now done with our presentation. So what you're going to do with this activity is it's going to help you narrow the focus of whatever your topic is. So you're trying to find a subtopic and you're going to be able to pull those out of whatever you come up with in the different sections of this activity. So you only have to do 3 points per section. So try to put some thought into what 3 points you're including. Because the more thought you put into it, the more it's going to help you narrow down the focus of whatever topic you pick. And then when you get to the end, you're going to do your working thesis. So using all of the stuff in these 6 sections, you're going to come up with a thesis you think that you want to write about for your topic. So as we went through and we did all of this stuff, talking about food and everything, maybe one of the things that I talked about, maybe I want to talk about this idea of food and music, or food as a way to bring people together. And maybe I want to focus on like food and music festivals. And that's going to be sort of my working thesis, is kind of focusing on this idea that food brings people together. And one way that it brings people together is at music festivals. So the focus is not going to be on the music festival itself, but the food that is at the music festival and what that food says about the people who attend the festival. So maybe that's the kind of articles that I want to look for. So that's the kind of stuff that you're going to be doing with this particular assignment and the working thesis. All right. And you're going to post all of that stuff in the discussion area and then give each other comments on it. So any questions about any of that stuff that I've gone over so far? Alright, I guess if there are no questions about anything, I'm probably going to wrap up the session because it's going for about 2 hours. And we are getting close to 9 o'clock. But if you've got questions, like, this is the time to ask. Well, I am a captive audience member to your questions. Okay, what's your question about the annotations? Let me pull up the annotation assignment. I get the feeling this is going to be a long question. Okay, give me an example. What's one word that you looked at? I will give you an example. So just tell me what page and what word it was, and I'll tell you how to do it. Okay, page 4. Oh, that's a doozy of a word. All right, let me see if I can find it. All right, so I don't think this will let me search in here. Let me go pull it up from here. I was gonna say, I'm not seeing that one. Is it hierophant? Because I think that was in here somewhere. Or is it etymological? Let me look up hierophant. Oh, really? You're not gonna let me edit this word? Okay. Alright. Alright, so I'm gonna have to... Okay, so let me look this word up. Okay. Well, I'll do both of them. I'll do that one and the these words. It's etymology. Etymologically. Alright. Let me find where that one is. Alright. So we'll do hierophant. Let me just put placeholder here. So I can... No, I don't want to put that. Placeholder. So I come back to it. And then let me look for the other one. So I'll do both of these words to give you an example. Okay. Okay, it's right above that. Okay. Okay. So I'll just put my other placeholder here so I won't lose those two. Alright, so we're going to start by, you want to kind of do this whole, what I would recommend is doing this whole sentence because it's going to make more sense if you do the whole sentence kind of together instead of trying to breaking the words apart from each other because they're going to be dependent on the other words that are around them. So, thank you for posting the definition. So, an etymology is basically where words come from. So, if you think about like modus operandi is Latin, and that's where a lot of words, when we talk about the etymology of a word, we literally mean the evolution of where that word comes from, which I think is sort of the same thing that this definition that you found is talking about, is basically it's the evolution of words. So what he's talking about in this section when he's talking about this word monstrum is he's saying that a construct and a projection, the monster exists only to be read. The monstrum is etymologically that which reveals, that which warns, a glyph that seeks a hierophant. So he's basically saying that the term monstrum is historically, it has meant that which reveals, that which warns. If you go and look up the term monstrum and translate it, it literally translates to these two the terms that he's basically put in quotations. That's how you know that he's citing something else. He didn't come up with those. So it basically means a warning. And if you're going to put the word etymologically into context of this sentence, then he's basically saying that even the word monster, with this whole idea of that which reveals itself and that which warns, it's kind of saying that they exist to be deciphered. They exist to be read. So it's not like read, like reading a text, but read as in like reading to decipher something. And so that's a way that you can kind of explain this passage, is that etymologies are the evolution of words. And so back in the olden days, when you would hear the word monstrum, you wouldn't think monster. You would think warning, or you would think something that reveals something that's hidden, or the hidden. And now when we hear the word monster, it has a completely different connotation to it. And then if we talk about hierophant, so let me pull up my dictionary, because I know what a hierophant is, but I want to make sure that I explain it correctly. So a hierophant is a person, especially a priest in ancient Greece, who interprets sacred mysteries or esoteric principles. So I knew it was like a type of priest. So think about this, like if you sort of imagine ancient Greece and like the priestesses and priests that would stay in the temples, and you would, like, they're oracles. So you would go to them and they would basically interpret these sacred texts. It's a little bit the same as like at the Vatican where the Pope is. They have a lot of like ancient like Christian scrolls and stuff, and they're like the hierophants of those. Like they read and interpret those texts. And so what he's saying, if I was explaining this and sort of putting it in a context, he's basically saying that a monster is like a symbol that's asking to be deciphered. It's a symbol that's asking to be read. And we know that from its root word, the root word being monstrum, which means that which reveals, that which warns. A glyph is like a symbol. So I'll look up glyph just so I'm not like lying. It's kind of like hieroglyphics is sort of the... a glyph is basically any graphical symbol that can be used to represent something. So if you're a graphic designer, basically any letter, number, all of those things are considered glyphs because we use them as a symbol for language. So that's essentially what a glyph is. So he's basically saying that monsters, like these sacred symbols, are looking for these people to read them. They're looking for somebody to come and decipher them the same way that these priests decipher these sacred texts. So that's kind of how I would explain this section, if that helps. So that's how you can help put those words into context. Does that make sense? Was there another section that you wanted me to do an example for? Okay. Were there any other questions? Thank you. That was a great question, actually, because it shows that you don't have to do a big passage to actually have a lot to talk about in this particular text. I personally think that it's an interesting text just because of the way that he writes stuff. It's very poetic language, and it gives you a lot to kind of, you know, critically chew on, basically. So it gives you a lot to kind of think about, especially with his word choice. I think there's a lot of criticism about this particular author because they're like, why can't he just be straightforward and just come out and say it? But I kind of appreciate the way that he paints pictures. I like that he sort of paints this picture in your head. So the topics for the brainstorming, you will be using those to write your essay. So I would pick a topic you're actually going to be interested in doing. So on the course website, if you go to the writing projects kind of down here at the bottom, there are 4 topics. So there's comics and cultural representation, food as cultural transmitter, movies and cultural identity, and then music for social change. Jacqueline, you're hilarious. So you're going to have those are the 4 topics that you can pick from. So when you're doing your brainstorm cubing, you want to pick whichever topic you're actually going to be interested in. So if you're interested in music, then that's the one that you'll do your brainstorm cubing on. Or if you're interested in movies, then that's the one that you'll do your cubing on. And the brainstorm cubing, the goal is to try to narrow down this topic, because even though these topics seem narrow, they're really not. Like, you can narrow these down way further. So the goal is to try to narrow down your topic as much as possible. Like, not too narrow, but it should still be sort of broad enough that you could kind of expand out if you need to. But you don't want to do food as a cultural transmitter because that's like a super broad topic. Like, there's so many different ways that you can talk about that. So if you go into the pages for these, so the top sort of gives you a general kind of overview of how food is a cultural transmitter, or I'm sorry, the top of this one, all of them have the same thing, I think, at the beginning, where it talks about what cultural transmitters are. And then it talks about the popular media. So then it has sort of a little section about that particular topic. And then where it says exploring culture through food, this one basically talks about the topic. Then you've got some background information. So I try to find articles that will give you some background information about this as a topic. So this one is food culture, what is it? And then here's your literature review stuff. If you click on this button, it's going to take you into the folder that has all of the articles and stuff in it. And then underneath that, you've got some example subtopics. So you don't have to write about these subtopics. Your brainstorm cubing should be helping you come up with a subtopic you want to write about. So some of the subtopics that I kind of came up with as I was doing research to find articles was food and cultural traditions. So if, as you were doing your brainstorm cubing and you picked food and you were going through it and most of your stuff was talking about like food traditions, so like how we have a food tradition with Thanksgiving, we have a food tradition with Christmas. If you're from like another country, then maybe you like, I know like Mexico, they have the Day of the Dead, and I know like there's some food traditions that go along with that. Different parts of the world have different food traditions for different holidays. So maybe that was the thing that you sort of focused on when you were doing your brainstorm cubing. So that would be your subtopic. one of the articles in there is about food and memory. There's some articles in there about how food is used in books and literature. So the role that plays. So if during your brainstorming, you were talking a lot about food and movies and that kind of stuff. So you're looking for ways to kind of narrow down your subtopic. Does that make sense? Yep. Any other questions? Like I said, the comics and movies should be up by this weekend. I probably won't work on it tonight because it's already 9 o'clock. And the last time I started working on this at 9 o'clock, I was up till 2 a.m. So I'm probably not going to do that. I'll probably work on it tomorrow a little bit to try to get one of them up. And then I'll work on it on Friday to get to the last one up. So they should hopefully be up by the weekend. And then once I get those up, I'll start working on the analytical essay examples. So those aren't filled in yet for the topics, but it will be a while before we have to get to those. All right, any other questions about either the annotation activity or the brainstorm cubing or anything else in the class? So you do have to complete all 10 for it to give you a check mark, because that's part of the completion criteria, is you do have to have 10 annotations. But I think the way Perusal is set for your class is it should be pushing annotations automatically back to Blackboard. So as you're doing your annotations, it should be updating the score in Blackboard automatically, I think. And what I've been telling people in the class is that as you're doing your annotations, keep doing the, and you finish your 10 and you don't have a check mark, don't keep adding annotations, because what that means is that the annotations that you have added are not high enough quality. So what you can do instead is go back in and edit your previous annotations. So like in this example, let me do one that's shorter than this. That one's really long. And I'll zoom in so you can see a little bit better. All right, so like this is my annotation up here. So, and I don't think this tells me what my grade is for this annotation, but let's say that I had a really short annotation. So let's say this is an annotation. Let me just put this definition in here. Let me do that. Let me go down to where it says hierophant. Okay. All right, so let's say where this placeholder is this is what I put in for my annotation. Let me redo that. There we go. So that's my annotation. I can already tell you that's going to come back as a low quality annotation because all it did was put a definition in. There's no explanation or anything. It'll probably give you a 1 for it just because it's a definition. But you should be relating this back to the text. Like you should be, oh, sorry, this was for glyph. Well, it doesn't matter. But you should be relating that back to the text. So what you can do is you can actually go in and edit it by clicking on it. And so you can add more stuff in. So I would actually go back in here and talk about, glyph, is a, and then I would add in this context it's talking about monsters as symbols and how we can read monsters the same way that we would read a glyph or symbol. And I would basically go into the discussion that I had when we talked about this before. And so that's what I would do to kind of fix this. And so if you're noticing that you're not getting check marks, I would go up to where it says all comments up here at the top. Tell it to just show you your comments. So you can just say my comments. And then when you click the all conversations over here on the side, let me kind of slide out of the way. So if you click where it says all conversations, it'll show you just your conversations. So you can go back through, and if you see, if you see something like this placeholder in there that's like super short where you didn't explain something fully, you can actually go back in and edit it and explain it better. So that's what I would recommend rather than adding a bunch of additional annotations, because the goal with this assignment is to improve the quality of the annotations that you're doing. Because this is going to give you practice with critically reading those articles that you're going to have to read for your literature review. Because as a reminder, your literature review, you're going to be literally evaluating and reviewing the articles and the chapters of these books that these other people have written. And if you aren't able to understand what they're talking about, you're not going to be able to accurately evaluate their arguments and what they're saying. And then you're going to use those same articles to write your analytical essay later. So the more practice you put into understanding this stuff, the easier it's going to be for you later on, because you're not going to be struggling because you're going to have that content knowledge. Does that help? Okay. Well, if you do have any more questions, you can ask them tomorrow in class. And we'll be going over the brainstorm cubing again in class tomorrow, so this will be refresh for you. All right, anybody else have any questions? All right, I guess if there are no other questions from anybody, I am gonna wrap up this stream. So, as always, here, I'll jump back over to just chatting. So if at any point, like, you need some help, these will be up in the archive, so you can go back and watch them later. So you can go back and review them at any point. But if you have any specific questions about anything, feel free to email me. And if you need additional help, so you're still not getting it or something like that, then you're always welcome to set up a one-on-one conference with me. Like, just send me an email and just say, hey, I want to set up a one-on-one so we can sit down and go through this stuff, and maybe give me some times that you're available. I'm available during my office hours, which are in the syllabus, and depending on like which day it is, I might be available in the afternoon or in the morning, usually after like 9 o'clock. So just send me an email and I'll let you know what my availability is. But all right, I hope you guys have a wonderful evening. Have good rest tonight, sweet dreams. And I will see you on Saturday. So this was a special sort of Wednesday makeup. We will be back to our regularly scheduled live virtual sessions on Saturday. So please join me on Saturday if you have any questions about the stuff that's going to be coming up next week. So when we are actually going to start diving into working on our literature reviews. All right. So that's pretty much it, and I hope that you all have a wonderful night.